Hello everyone, thanks for joining us for our webinar today, which is Global Payroll and GDPR, a technology-driven approach to compliance. My name's Jerome Smale, I'm editor of Reward Strategy magazine, and I'm joined today by Richard Limpkin, who's Chief Operating Officer for Immedis, and John Whelan, who's Partner Commercial and Technology for A&L Goodbody. As I say, thanks for joining us today. We've got a lot of interest in this topic, unprecedented interest, in fact, for our webinars. The topic is GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which comes into force on 25th of May next year. Obviously, there's a lot of planning involved, a lot of information that people need surrounding that, hence the interest today. So just to tell you a bit about our webinar, it's interactive, so you can send in your questions to our speakers live, and we'll have a section near the end of the webinar that deals with those. Don't worry if we don't answer your question live, your questions will be answered and we'll send you the answers. Also, we're going to be running several interactive polls. We've got 4 polls in total, and you can vote on those live. We'll come to those and we'll see the results coming in. So just tell you some of the topics we're going to be discussing today. So we're going to be talking about what GDPR really is to global payroll, where you should start, how you can protect your people and your organisation, what you should be particularly mindful of, and how you can prepare for your GDPR obligations. So, as I mentioned before, I'm joined by Richard Limpkin and John Whelan. I'm going to hand you over to those guys who tell you a little bit more about themselves and what they do. Richard, welcome. Perhaps we could start with you.
Thanks, Jerome. My name's Richard Limpkin. I'm Chief Operating Officer with Immedis. My background is nearly 20 years at this stage operating in HCM and payroll technology globally. That's across multiple jurisdictions, across most leading platforms and a variety of industries. As my background started out in science, particularly in physics and analytics, so I have a keen interest in understanding detail and then understanding how that detail impacts my customers. And really the focus for me today is to give you a technology perspective on GDPR and how that impacts your business. I'm delighted to be joined by my colleague John Whelan from A&L Goodbody. So John, over to you.
Thank you, Richard. So my name is John Whelan. I'm a partner in the Commercial and Technology Department of A&L Goodbody. I've been practicing in the area of tech law, unfortunately for nearly 20 years too. I've worked across a number of jurisdictions, London, Hong Kong, the US, and now back in Ireland. And I've seen, I think, the rise of data protection from the early days to what we're seeing now on the horizon with GDPR, primarily acting for multinational companies operating in and through Ireland, with a particular focus on the US, where I spent the last 3 years working with companies expanding into Europe. So I'm delighted to join the team for this discussion this morning. Thanks, Jerome.
That's great. Thanks, Richard and John. So before we start our discussion, we're going to start off with our first poll question. So I invite you to vote on this. The question is, who owns the GDPR compliance in your global payroll organisation? So you'll see your options come up there. Your options are Global Payroll Director, Data Protection Officer, Country Payroll Manager, Chief Financial Officer, or is it someone else? You've got the option for other there. So please vote now, and we'll see those results coming. In fact, results coming in thick and fast there. And the most popular at the moment is Data Protection Officer. So there seems to be quite a lot of people out there who are prepared. They know who's responsible. So we'll see the results coming in and changing there, but it's still the Data Protection Officers is the most popular. There's other, which obviously isn't. Who knows who that is, but you know who it is. That's the important thing. Okay, so let's start our discussion then. And our first point is what GDPR is to global payroll. John, perhaps I could ask you for your thoughts on this first.
Sure. So I was maybe just going to open up the discussion by giving some context to GDPR. It's a regulation that we're all more than familiar at this stage, and we do plan to touch on the key areas over the course of the next hour, but in particular from a payroll perspective. So taking it, from where it starts, we're currently operating under the guise of a directive, which dates back to 1995. And this is a new regulation that has been coming down the tracks for some time now. I mean, it's hard to think that we have been surviving with a piece of law or substantive law that's almost 23 years old now. But what we have now is what I think Europe wants to see as a cultural change with the introduction of this regulation. It will have direct effect, so that's important in terms of the date of implementation and introduction, which, as we all know, is the 25th of May 2018. That is a drop-dead date. People ask, will there be a transitional period? Well, we're in transition at the moment is the answer that we get from the regulators. It's interesting in an area of law insofar as we have the law, but then we also have the regulators and the regulation of this subject matter. And with that comes that added layer, I suppose, of having to predict not only what the law means, but also what regulators will interpret it to mean. Now, we are helped somewhat by various guidance from the regulatory authorities. So we have the Article 29 Working Party, which has already started to give us some guidance in some key areas. It will now change its name, I think, thankfully, to the European Data Protection Board. And we also get local domestic guidance. But what does it mean? And I've pointed the slide there. There is a cultural change. There is an increased compliance burden, and no doubt about that, and we'll touch on that as we go through the next while. Enhanced individual rights, greater sanctions for non-compliance, so essentially fines, we're all familiar with those, and this new regulatory environment, which we'll also touch on. It brings challenges to the entire business of all those, I think, attending this webinar. Ultimately, the buck stops with management, but interestingly, a breach can occur anywhere down the line. And I think, a key area is senior payroll managers and all staff in possession of HR data.
Great, thanks for that, John. I suppose it's time now to just have a little bit of a more specific think about the payroll function in the modern business and absolutely the global payroll function. The payroll function, to a degree, can be considered a little bit of a paradox in that due to the highly sensitive nature of the topic it deals with, it's often assumed to have all of the appropriate controls, security and measures in place, and therefore not given the appropriate level of additional focus, support and investment relative to other parts of the organization. The reality of most payroll functions is quite different to that perception. They deal with the constant pressure to deliver perfection to immovable deadlines. A lot of us are very familiar with that. Every piece of information that we deal with is sensitive personal information, both from a data categorization point of view, but also from the emotional perspective of those that the data relates to, the data subjects, as you'll hear them termed. Payroll operates in a highly connected and externalized environment, the nature of which is only increasing with the advent of initiatives like real-time information and other government data gateways. So closing the door and locking the data away just isn't a viable option, as it is for many other departments. The need to integrate with systems and vendors in the wider variety of SaaS solutions available is only increasing the drive as best-of-breed solutions become available, and those barriers to moving between providers is decreasing, so that the amount of data moving around the external environment is on the constant increase. Not to make anyone feel bad, that's just the reality of the world of global payroll. At Immedis, we know this, we understand it, and that's what we enjoy doing. If I think back now to the start of my career, I remember a very wise man saying to me in I think pretty much my first or second day of work, don't ever expect to be thanked for paying someone correctly, but goodness help you if you get it wrong. Now, it wasn't particularly reassuring on that day, but it stood to me to this day. I think I'm going to hand over to Jerome now for our next poll question.
Okay, thanks for that. So we'll move on to this next poll question, as you say. The question is, how progressed is your GDPR compliance plan in your payroll function? This will be interesting to find out. And the answers you can choose from are finalised. I'll be interested to see how many of those we get. Very progressed, in progress, or not progressed. So please vote now and we'll see what comes up. In progress, there's plenty plenty in progress, and as far as not progressed, there's quite a few of those. Very few finalised, and very few very progressed. So, guys, what are your thoughts on that? I'm guessing you're not enormously surprised by those results.
No, John here, Jerome. Certainly not. I think that with the awareness that is out there about GDPR, I mean, we're all so familiar with it now, and there's a huge amount of noise about it. I think everybody has started to make some progress now. We've had it, as I mentioned earlier, we're coming into the fourth quarter of a 2-year transitional period, and I would say certainly most of our clients, apart from those who have heavy use of data, so for example social media clients or big financial institutions, who would probably have plans in for some time now. But most companies are turning to address this issue now. The 6-month time period or lead-in is probably a good one for people to feel that they're in progress and moving into this very progress stage.
Great.
Yeah,
I'd very much agree.
Sorry, go on.
I would just say I very much agree with that. I think the point that John made earlier on is that there really isn't any transition beyond the 25th of May. So what we really need to see across the board at this point is the in progress moving towards very progressed at quite a rapid pace for everybody to be in a compliant position.
I think we're very impressed with those who have finalised their preparation.
That's good.
Yes. Yeah, not many, but yeah, it's good to see some. So with that in mind, moving on to our next point of discussion, which is where to start. So Richard, perhaps you'd like to tell us.
Thanks, Jerome. So whilst GDPR may seem a fairly intimidating topic across the board, it's really only applying a law to what many of us have been doing as good practice anyway. So the first key steps really shouldn't be too much of a surprise in terms of starting with the process. Knowing your data intimately is the key thing. So what does this really mean? It means down to the very field and cell level, what information your function holds on which individuals, and very importantly, why you hold that information. The purpose to which the data relates is vital. This was fundamentally addressed in Immedis by implementing a full data management framework, with each element of data held having a known purpose and usage in the data catalog. Now that's a very easy thing to implement in concept, but really it just takes time and effort and focus on the data you hold. It can be achieved by undergoing a data audit process, and you'll see on the screen in front of you, in terms of our own management framework, every action and activity that happens in any piece of data, whether it be at rest or in motion, is tracked and managed through our framework. And that's a vital piece, and we'll touch on that later on in terms of being able to demonstrate control and compliance. More typically, this is done very well during implementation as part of the data migration activity, but it's very easy beyond a payroll or a HR implementation for that to grow arms and legs over a period of time with regards to the data you're holding. Particular business needs can increase the need to hold additional information that might not actually be in line with the purpose of the function that you're running. If I think of a recent example in terms of a UK retail bank separation that I was involved in, there were over 500 data points that were mapped and managed and migrated through 19 data migration reviews. And every single one of those data points were the critical ones that were retained. There were hundreds of others that were discarded through the migration because they didn't serve a function in terms of where they're being migrated to. So it's not a small undertaking, but certainly anyone who would undertake this, their payroll function would be in a much, much stronger position as a result. The next key thing really to start to address in terms of preparedness is data residency. Now, this was a much more difficult concept in the early stages of cloud offerings, but it's a much better understood thing now. Almost any cloud provider will provide you with an understanding of exactly where your data is held. Technical solutions that have been implemented in Immedis ensure that data relating to European citizens is hosted, managed and processed within Europe alone, and that includes EU data centers in all cases. Recent analysis has shown that 74% of cloud services provided globally wouldn't suit this purpose. So it really is vital that you understand where you hold your data. Once you understand your data and you know where your data is, you can then start to minimize your exposure to risk through a principle really that is less is more. If you don't need the data for processing payroll, you shouldn't be holding it. And that's something that can be quite challenging for any organization if systems have been in place for a very long period of time. As I said earlier, that will have grown arms and legs, so it's a critical review point. Old school integration approaches in terms of sending everything from a HR system to a payroll system and assuming that the payroll system will just find the pieces it needs and discard the rest, that's a considerable risk for any organization now in terms of receiving information you don't need. So those styles of integration points between systems need to be considered. We've made this very simple at Immedis by ensuring at the point of data take-on, only the fundamental data is known by payroll and retained. Now that you have some context on where you should start, I'm going to pass over to John to talk about some of the reasons as to why you should start there.
Thanks, Richard. I think it's safe to say that the Immedis offering as just described is probably one that's particularly well down the road. I think, as we see from that poll question, most people have their plans in progress, and I think it's fair to say they're coming to terms with what they need to do. And as Richard said, that issue of knowing your data is so key. And whereas up to now, data controllers, which is probably most of those people on this webinar, would have probably heavily relied on their data processors or their technology providers to manage this aspect. That responsibility has been balanced back in favour of controllers and processors. Not only the practical management of data, but the legal responsibility is now much more even. So from a data controller's perspective, the key questions are, if I could summarise it from a legal perspective, is what, where, how and why. So what data do you hold? Where do you hold it? Is it, for example, in Europe? Is it outside Europe? Is it in the cloud? How you hold it? How secure is it? And that touches on some of the points that Richard was talking about. The need now to understand your security measures, and we'll come back to that in the next session. And why you hold it, bearing in mind that you can only use it for the very narrow purpose for which you hold it. And they are the basics which a data controller now has to know the answers to if they're approached. The regulators are saying you can't say, oh, wait till I get onto my data processor or my tech provider, we'll get back to you with those answers. You need to know, and you need to demonstrate that you know the answers to these questions. So that does create challenges. You need to understand, audit, monitor the use of data. And then this issue of minimization, which Richard touched on, which I think is a key kind of principle underpinning GDPR, that you should only be collecting data that you need. So it even goes to the collection point of view, not just what you're processing, but only ask for what you need. So why do we do this? Two very simple reasons from the legal perspective: to demonstrate compliance to regulatory authorities. Up till now, regulators had very limited teeth compared to what they will have post-May 2018. And secondly, it tended to be reacting, our parties and regulators in some cases react to events. So if a breach could be proved, that's all going to change, and there's going to be a lot more preventative measures put in place by regulators. So regardless of incidents, you have to be able to prove your compliance with GDPR. And secondly, to deal with data subject access requests, and their increased rights. So those rights are to access to the data, rectification, erasure, restriction of the use of their data by you, the right not to be profiled, the right to know at any point in time who and to whom you have disclosed their data. So all of these are increased rights that will inevitably require an increased administrative burden on behalf of clients.
Great, thanks, John. That leads us nicely on to how to protect your people and your organisation. and they're not two separate topics, as we'll soon find out. A key point really in this area is that there's no technical definition of what adequate really is in terms of security. So what I'm going to give you today is an understanding of what we at Immedis have implemented to protect your personal data, but also what you should be looking at from other service providers as a standard. So some of these things will be no surprise and no new news to anyone in terms of encryption being a fundamental part of what we do, from the secure web portal through which information is communicated, to the additional layers of encryption that have been implemented in the traffic, in the infrastructure, in the database itself, and then on top of all of that, down to a field level within the database. And you can actually see an example on the screen of something that would actually normally be seen in normal form is an international bank account number, but in encrypted form is absolutely useless to anybody. It cannot be traced back to its original form. And that's a vital concept. It means that even at the most technical level of access to our systems at database administrator level, the data is still not usable. And that's vital for protecting the privacy of information. So whether your data is at rest or in motion, privacy is still maintained. There are many places in your organization where data can be suitably anonymized by rolling it up. For example, an individual salary would not be discernible in your company accounts. The data has been anonymized to that point. However, what about when you average pay information by role, by gender, by department, and then publish this, and there's only one male or one female in a small department? Suddenly, supposedly average and anonymous data is no longer average or anonymous, and that has taken organizations by surprise. That, I imagine, happens quite regularly. So it's the nuances within the data and their potential use that are really going to cause the most concern. And this leads back to knowing your data and knowing your data's purpose. Another key concept for GDPR is the idea of pseudonymization. Not a particularly easy thing to say, but it's also a critical principle. And really what's different between that and anonymization is that anonymization cannot be reversed. Pseudonymization is a method through which a data's subject can be masked, but while still being able to fulfill the function. So obviously for payroll reasons, that's absolutely vital. You couldn't anonymize payroll information and still be able to process payroll. So what we've implemented in Immedis is the ability to separate the data itself from the data subject as such, from the person it relates to. And the two things are held completely separately. And without both sides of the coin, you can't see the full picture. Now, this is a principle of privacy by design. This is implemented throughout our system. I'd love to be able to take credit for that. I'd love to be able to say that's as an advent of GDPR. It isn't. It's something that just comes out of good practice in data management, and it's something we've implemented across the board. So, John, I expect you probably a few further thoughts on that area.
Yeah, I mean, security is a key element of data protection law generally. It is, in terms of the current law, founded in one of the principles of data protection law, the European principles, and the other area where you see it often in practice is in data processing contracts. And I think that's an interesting point just to focus on in terms of controller processor contracts. So that's contracts that you have with anybody who you share data with. As we know, up until now, there are typically two provisions that need to be in those contracts. And that includes contracts with Immedis currently. And that is that the processor acts on the instructions of the controller, firstly, and secondly, that the processor will have adequate security measures in place. Now, as Richard said, it's very difficult to define what that means. We can get some industry practice, but it is now an important legal requirement on both parties under the new GDPR. What is also interesting is this new approach to those contracts insofar as there's significantly more terms that now need to be mandatorily included in data processing contracts. And these have to be in place by 25th of May 2018. But there's also a change in the regulators' approach to how controllers should manage those contracts in practice. So I've seen one regulator recently talk at a public event, giving an example of a fund manager and fund administrator, which would have a typical data processing contract in place. and making the point that it was no longer sufficient for a contract to be signed and that to be put in the drawer, that the controller has to have significant engagement with the processor in understanding what the security measures are, in agreeing that they are sufficient, and in monitoring and auditing them over the period of the agreement with the processor. So a very new and different approach there to controllers' responsibilities, which I think to date may have been a little bit amiss in terms of the practice. And as I say, the security obligations are not just about best practice and industry guidance, but they are legal obligations, and that's something that we all need to grapple with, and no matter what business we're in, whether we're in a law firm or any type of customer of payroll, for example, those on this webinar. It is a people and systems process. Myself and Richard were discussing this earlier. It's an end-to-end process, all of which is subject to governance, and really is only as good as its weakest link. And if you may have all the systems in place and all the security in place, but there is this additional element of having, your people trained. So anybody who has access to these systems need to follow protocols that ensure their robustness. One only has to look at some examples of regulators' annual reports and case studies to see that it's often human error that gives rise to breaches of data protection law. To cite a few, employees' performance ratings being disclosed to other staff. A breach was found by the Irish regulator in that case. Again, down to somebody just sending a spreadsheet to too many people. The extent of access to data through an organisation, somebody just making documents available to those who didn't need them, when they should have only been made available to those that needed them for example, managerial functions. Another instance where the data protection regulator commended a company for having a 3-password system, but when the matter was investigated, established that 2 of those passwords were made available to wide groups of people, undermining the process. So I think, Richard, you'd agree, if you have the people trained and the people within your organisation protecting data privacy, that will protect the organisation, and people are at the core of compliance.
Yeah, I'd very much agree with that, John. I think the key principle here is protecting the individual, and that by its nature protects the wider organisation. I think at this point we're passing over to Jerome for the third poll question.
Yeah, thanks guys. So our third poll question is, let's assume GDPR was put into action tomorrow. So we're imagining it's 24th of May. Sorry, Christmas has been cancelled, but it's spring outside, so swings and roundabouts. But let's assume GDPR was put into action tomorrow. Would you know how to respond to a data access request? So your options are yes, no, or we have a plan in place. So let's see how you're doing. Okay, so no is the winner there, not surprisingly, perhaps. In fact, yeah, by some way. But still 22.4% are saying yes, and there are plans in place clearly. So what do you make of those results, guys?
We'll actually touch on that in a little bit. It's quite appropriate that the no has come out quite strongly there. That whole area of the data subject access request is something we'll be talking about in terms of steps to being prepared. So that'll draw us nicely to a close later on.
Yeah, I think I'd agree. Not surprised at such a high number. I think the concept of responding to data subject access requests is probably reasonably well known by companies because they currently can be subject to those. But I think it's a new layer of regulation around those, the lesser timeframes within which responses have to be given, and the greater influence that individuals can have over the data. So an access request might be requesting just a copy of their data, but they may also request it to be updated, for it to be restricted or indeed deleted. I think that's the administrative challenge, and it'd be interesting actually to hear later from Richard how Immedis is addressing those requests, because I think it's a request that controllers are very dependent on processors to respond to.
Exactly that. Yep, we'll come to that later on.
Absolutely. So we'll move on to our next point of discussion then, which is what should you be mindful of? So John and Richard, what are the key issues here? Perhaps John, you could start us off.
Yeah, so I just put up 3 or 4 points there that I thought would be most relevant, and as I see from my experience, what people are most concerned with. Obviously, special categories of data and consent. So special categories of data is essentially what used to be known as sensitive data. It'll probably still be referred to as sensitive data, but that's just a new terminology. And the requirement for consent around the processing of that data. We know what special categories are. They're racial or ethnic origin, political opinions, religious or philosophical beliefs, trade union membership, health or sex life, and now including genetic, i.e. DNA data, and biometric data, fingerprints and facial recognition. So all of those have much more stricter requirements, and whereas there is one important exception in the directive around the processing of this data in the field of employment, which I think is important in the context of today's discussion. There is still a very high expectation of increased security measures around that data. So that's something that people are definitely grappling with, and particularly in the area of consent, because there is a question mark generally over, and particularly in the employment context, whether free consent can be given. So that's a challenge for employers, but you're also seeing it in just general day-to-day interaction with companies, that consent is an area that people are leaning away from, not least because it can be withdrawn, and that leaves you in a difficult position, but people are looking to rely on other exemptions for data processing under GDPR, such as performance of a contractual obligation or legal obligation in law. Secondly, I put up there inadvertent disclosures, and I touched on that earlier. Human error is such a significant part of the problems that companies face when it comes to data breaches, and staff need to be trained. That's enshrined in the GDPR, that everybody needs to know what is going on. And you do need to take these measures, that if there is human error, that you have at least, for example, pseudonymized or encrypted data, as Richard touched on earlier. I mean, you do get some leeway there. If data is lost, for example, that is pseudonymized or encrypted, you don't, for example, have to notify data subjects because the data isn't going to be disclosed without that additional information. Thirdly, post-2018 focus. So, it is obviously extremely important that at this point in time and over the next 6 months, there is a focus on getting ready for GDPR. But I don't think things will stop there. I mean, just to state the obvious, it's only after that point that regulators' powers and significant powers kick in. And we touched on it earlier that it is too late to leave things till 2018, but it also would be too late just to stop there. And this is a longer-term play which companies will have to consider and continue to consider. And finally, response plans in place. We just touched on it there in the last poll question, where people said they weren't ready to answer data access requests, or a large majority weren't. And I do think that is because of the shorter reporting time limits. When people come to us and in relation to a data security breach, they're in semi-crisis mode, and really it's about having a response plan in place so that things don't go off track. The reporting element is very important. Up until now, most or a lot of reporting was voluntary, and a judgment call had to be made as to whether to engage with regulators. And under the new rules, it's 72 hours unless there's no risk to data subjects. So a big change is seen there, and I think it's going to be an area that requires some focus over the coming months and years.
Great, thanks, John. I suppose unsurprisingly, my thoughts are fairly well aligned with John's. We've debated this a lot over the last few weeks. As we discussed earlier, unfortunately, payroll cannot anonymize its data. We live in a world of deeply sensitive and highly personal information, which we're legally obliged to make available to organizations outside our own. So be mindful of your obligations to the individual's right to privacy and the fact that that's now becoming law. Don't rush something that will put your organization at risk is my first key point. Work with your vendors to understand what you need to do and understand the plans, processes and controls that they have in place to help you meet your obligations. The second piece really is to do with the additional burdens that this will bring. There's no doubt that GDPR is going to introduce additional privacy burdens to every organization. In payroll, we're used to this. The obligations, the privacy components, be ready for this and make sure that you're able to react and respond. This means data subject access requests and data breach processes in place. These will not be easy things to respond to, and they will take time and effort. The third piece is data breach stakeholders and processes are a critical piece of compliance with GDPR. Make sure you know exactly what to do, when to do it, and make sure that's before the first time an incident happens. As John rightly pointed out earlier, this is a key component. Never get caught wondering where the fire exit is when the building is burning down around you, and that's the situation you would be in if there were a data incident and you didn't have the plan, process and controls in place. As John rightly outlined earlier, whilst the likes of Immedis have implemented extreme technical security and privacy measures, there are people involved in your payroll process internally. It's not a purely systemized end-to-end process. And it's very likely that those people involved will be the people who might ultimately circumvent the safeguards and controls. So that training and awareness piece is absolutely fundamental. And again, to talk to what John said earlier, this end-to-end piece is only as strong as the weakest link. So ultimately, from a payroll perspective, embrace the fact that we're good at protecting people's data. We already deal with the difficult stuff, but don't get complacent because of this. There's very likely to be a zero tolerance policy come 25th of May and onwards, and put the right systems and processes in place. At Immedis, we've done this. If in doubt, don't take a chance. Ask your data protection officer first, or whoever carries that role. Okay, I think we're on to Jerome now for the next poll question.
Right, yeah, thanks guys. Some really interesting points there. I think especially the fact that it's not all about 25th of May 2018, it's about beyond that as well. I think that needs to be borne in mind, definitely. So anyway, on to our fourth and final poll question before we get to answering some of your questions live. So our question is, how prepared is your payroll function to demonstrate the adequacy of its internal and external security measures for its data processing? And you'll see your options there are very prepared, almost prepared, I don't know, adequate but cannot be demonstrated. So it'll be interesting to see what we've got here. And I don't know is the clear winner there for the time being. So 25%, so a quarter, we're just over now, almost prepared, very prepared, in the minority, of course. And there's evidence of adequate but cannot be demonstrated, again, just under a quarter. So what do you think to those results, guys?
Yeah, I'm not surprised. Now, I'm not a tech person, but I'm not surprised that such a large number said they don't know, because I think, as I said earlier in the webinar, people tended to kind of rely on their processors to put in place security measures. And I think people also relies often on, frankly, their IT department and the reporting back that, yes, we have security measures in place. And I think it tended to, in my experience, stop there. So business owners and people working in managerial positions probably didn't have to understand what the security measures were. That will change because they will have to be answerable. They will have to have considered the security measures that are in place. They will have to document their consideration of those security measures under the new principles of privacy by design, if it's a new product offering or service, they'll have to have documented that as well, which will involve security measures, data minimization, etc. So I think I'm not surprised, given that these are probably issues that didn't trouble people in managerial positions up to now, that it tended to be purely an IT type consideration, but that's changed.
Yeah, I'd very much agree. I think that's one of the most fundamental points in being prepared for GDPR, is that this isn't just a technology or an IT issue. This is a business-wide concern. And to John's point, classically, security, privacy, protecting information has been considered a technology or an IT function, and that's just not the case. This really is down to the business owners now to own and manage the entire end-to-end plan for compliance.
Okay, guys, thanks for that. I think we've got quite a few questions come in. As I say, we won't have a chance to answer them all, but don't worry, you will get your questions answered where possible in written form. But guys, perhaps you'd like to answer a couple of questions live that have come in for us.
Yeah, sure. I just picked up two here, which are kind of connected or related. One is, how long can we keep payroll data with GDPR? Is it still 6 years plus? And then I think linked to that is, what do you do with ex-employees' data, as surely this is required going forward. So that raises, they're two very good questions of how long you can hold on to data. And the simple answer under GDPR is you may hold the data only for so long as is necessary. Now, then I think companies need to take a step back and look at what data they do hold and for how long. And if, to take a simple example, if it's a sale of a service that is a passing one-off, they may take a view, for example, 2 years or 6 years because of the statute of limitations. But we do come up against instances where clients say, well, look, we need this for a lot longer. And one example which I've come up against recently is in the area of pensions, when claims under pension schemes can come out of the woodwork from 30, 40 years ago, and there are examples of that where cases have gone to Europe. So the answer to that question is how long. It is about, again, and this is back to the accountability principle under GDPR, that you have considered the issue, you have worked out a good basis for the length of time that you keep the particular data in question. Now, if that just doesn't stand up on two legs, i.e., you're keeping fleeting information for 10 years, that's just not going to wash. But if you have a good legal basis and it can be taken into factor any type of issues that come up in any data retention type policy, whether it's tax rules, claims under contract, or indeed pension matters. Now, in terms of ex-employees, I think, again, for a certain period of time, but what will be really important is, because again, this issue came up in the context of pensions, is that data that you're keeping of people who've moved on, that it is locked down, that it is very secure. So it's not, to use Richard's example earlier, it's not continually processed by data processes, that there is very strict security measures around it. So it's a little bit of going back to what the GDPR says, keep it only for so long as is necessary and just have good reasons for that period of time that you choose.
Very good. I'm going to pick up on one question. I'm conscious of time, so I'll keep this quite brief. The question is around whether do you have to appoint a data protection officer? And I suppose from a legal standpoint, if you're a public authority, if you're involved in the large-scale systematic monitoring of personal information or the large-scale processing of personal sensitive data, which obviously in the case of payroll is ourselves, then yes, you do. Otherwise, there's no obligation, I believe, John, to appoint. Yeah,
no, that's absolutely right. So there's there are some examples given, and the obvious one that Richard just mentioned is the large-scale, those who engage in large-scale processing of data. There is an Article 29 Working Party guidance on DPOs specifically, and I think every organisation should have a read of that, or at least their legal people. And it has identified types of companies that will have to have a DPO under that general rule. So financial institutions, look, large banks, they are doing large-scale processing. As Richard said, Immedis is doing large-scale processing. So you need to decide whether you're legally required, in light of that guidance and with maybe some advice, to appoint a DPO. And it is an important decision because, one, it says if you don't choose one, that you have to have documented why you felt you didn't. So that process has to be gone through. That decision process has to be carried through. Secondly, I think the appointment of a DPO is an important role. It's a statutory role, and it does bring certain protections and obligations on the company with regard to their interactions with that DPO or data protection officer. To take the extreme example that a DPO can't be let go because a company doesn't agree with their views. Another is a DPO can't be involved in the decisions around what data processing is taking place, or it should just be monitoring and giving advice as to what is planned. So it is an important issue. All that being said, at a minimum, I think people should be considering whether they have a DPO lowercase, so not the official role, but somebody who has responsibility. And in a lot of companies, this would probably fall down to a subcommittee. But that person has to be, I think, relatively senior. So they have to have the ear of the board of directors. Management have to know. I mean, if you look at this in the context of cybersecurity in the financial services sector, the financial services authorities have said, management need to be engaged on a monthly basis with the security measures that are in place. So it's an important consideration.
Very good. I'm going to pick up on just one other very, very brief question, which I think might be useful for people in the area of global payroll. And the question is around, will employers be required to notify staff when they're sharing their data with service providers externally? And the simple guidance on this is yes, you will.
Yeah, that's
right.
It's a basic obligation. Sharing it is a disclosure, disclosing data. It's processing, as we mentioned earlier. Almost anything you do with personal data constitutes data processing. So disclosure of any form will require the consent, as a general rule, consent, or some form of notification whereby it would be expected that such data would be shared, and that particularly under GDPR, that sharing and the possibility of that sharing is set out in the company's privacy policy.
Right, excellent. Thanks for answering those questions, guys. It's been a really informative discussion. Perhaps you could just give us a brief summary of what we've spoken about and how to prepare for GDPR obligations before we close.
Sure. So we thought we'd just finish very briefly. I think our time is nearly up, and we've covered a lot, but not to kind of leave you without anything. So we thought we'd look at what would be a typical step plan for preparedness. And given the poll questions earlier, some of you will be further down the road. Some of you will not have started down the road, and so this is just to give you our kind of sum up in 1 minute of what needs to be done. So firstly, and you'll find various step plans out there. This is just our whistle-stop tour to wrap up this session. Firstly, awareness. So ensure that decision makers and key people are aware of the likely impact of the regulation. And that starts probably with, for those who haven't started yet, with today, so that you're attending webinars and making yourselves aware of the obligations. Data inventory. Know what data you hold, where it's held, how it's held, and for what purpose. Communicate privacy information. You will all undoubtedly need to look at your privacy notices, because most, I would say, are not GDPR compliant if they're just looking at the current rules. They'll have to be updated. Individual rights. You will have additional administrative burden in dealing with access requests. You need to prepare for that. Leading on to that, access requests. So it's the nature of the access requests that will change, and you need to be prepared for those and to be responding within the new time limits. Working out, number 6, on what legal basis you do process. Is it consent, which is the next consideration? If it is, you will need to do some due diligence on the consent that you have and whether it may be compliant with current regime, but whether it complies with the new regime. If it's not consent, then deciding upon which legal basis you process is important. Data breaches, having the response plan in place. Data protection by design. Any new service offering or product that you offer to a customer or an employee internally, you need to have considered it from a data protection perspective. Are you collecting the least amount of information in order to deliver this new offering? And then finally, the international piece, which is key, knowing where the data is. If it's outside the EEA, you will have to put in place a number of measures in relation to that. There will be some discussion at some point around Brexit. I don't think it's going to be an issue. The UK, once it leaves Europe, will undoubtedly put an arrangement in place. That remains to be seen what it is, but I think we'll all be fine on that front.
Great, thanks for that, John. There's some really fundamental points there, and I think it's a great step plan for implementing GDPR compliance. There's a few of those I'm just going to really draw a light to in terms of global payroll. The first one really is obtaining the right to process permissions and obtaining consent to process the information. That's a really fundamental thing in terms of managing people's personal information for payroll. Another key one is the principle of privacy by design. Now, what I'd really recommend on this is that you'd implement a privacy impact assessment. So any change to business practice, procedure, products, systems should really be assessed to how it impacts the privacy of the information it holds or relates to. And by implementing that, you're much more able to catch a potential breach before it occurs and avoid that happening rather than having that impact the business. And then really the final one is to thoroughly understand what you transfer, what you process, where it's held and by whom. And this really draws back to John's point earlier of what, where, who and how. And they're really fundamentals of knowing your data, having gone through a data mapping exercise and a data audit process. That will really put you in a very strong position as a payroll function to manage your people's information. And by managing and protecting those people, protecting the organization. So at that point, I'd just like to say thanks to John Whelan for his input today and time available for this. And thank you all very much for your attention today. I really hope you found this presentation useful, and I hope it sets you up well for GDPR compliance on the 25th of May 2018.
Yeah, thanks so much, Richard and John, for joining us today. It's been a really informative discussion and lots of valuable information. And thank you to everybody for joining us today. I hope you've enjoyed this webinar. I hope you take away a lot of the guidance that's been shared with you. This will be available to view again. Look out on our website, reward-strategy.com, for details on that. We'll be publishing a link where you can view this webinar again. And again, if you didn't get your question answered, don't worry, you will receive an answer from the guys. So again, thanks to everybody, and hope you join us for another one of our webinars soon. Good luck with your GDPR preparations.